Speaking of the European Union, I think that we have a really nice progression from one segment to the other. There are a lot of questions about the character of this union. And the question is, what is this supposed to be? Is it just an economic union? And entrance into it means that a lot of the member states will have to sacrifice to a significant extent what they perceive to be in favor of their national interest and traditional values that are not economic values necessarily. You could say values such as community, national sentiment, national loyalty, or things like that. Or is it something that can take the form of a confederacy which respects its members? This is one of the major questions. And I think that one of the really interesting things to talk about is the Polish government that suggested that there will be a referendum on illegal migrations, among other things. There will be 4 questions, and illegal migration is supposed to be one of them. But before we say more about that, and since we're speaking about whether we can coexist despite disagreement, you can visit a website. For £5 a month, you can gain access to all the premium content and watch videos such as the latest symposium I had with Josh, Symposium 32, Surviving Disagreement, where we're basically saying that disagreement is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has a connection to violent conflict, but on the other hand, there is such a thing, at least I think, and you agree with me on that, that
there was quite an ironic thing of we basically agreed throughout the entire thing on disagreement, which
yes, there are
quite comical.
I think there are ways in which we can turn disagreement into something that is actually constructive.
I think one thing that we should have addressed is that there are people with whom civil disagreement isn't possible, whereby if, for example, they want to tyrannize you, you can't say, I want to agree to disagree.
I think we did address it towards the end.
Oh, we did.
We said that there needs to be an exercise of judgment with respect to when someone actually disagrees on good faith or not.
Yes.
Yeah. So we did touch upon it. Yeah. So one of the things that we are going to talk about is the Polish Prime Minister announced that there will be a referendum simultaneously with the next Polish elections that are the national elections that will take place on the 15th of October this year. Now, the major issue of disagreement here between the Polish government and arguably the Polish people and, let's say, some officials of the European Union is the compulsory migrant relocation scheme that has been agreed upon by members of the EU Council.
That's quite an Orwellian term for it as well, isn't it? Compulsory migration. It just sounds scary, doesn't it? Let alone the actual content of what it is.
And let us see here a bit what it is. Okay, it says relocation and resettlement. Relocation. Under the emergency relocation scheme adopted by the Council in September 2015, asylum seekers with a high chance of having their applications successfully processed are relocated from Greece and Italy, where they have arrived, to other member states where they will have their asylum applications processed. If these applications are successful, the applicants will be granted refugee status with a right to reside in the member state to which they're relocated. The EU budget provides financial support to the participant member states. And if we scroll down a bit here, it says, in May 2015, the Commission proposed a European resettlement scheme, which was adopted by the Council in July 2015. To avoid displaced persons in need of protection having to resort to the criminal networks of smugglers and traffickers, the resettlement program provides legal and safe pathways to enter the EU. That's weird because they are already in the EU. This is supposed to be a scheme that concerns migration from within member states. So it's really weird that they write it this way.
It's also interesting that it almost seems like they're trying to make it easier for migrants to get to Europe, in a sense, from the language that they're using there. They're saying, well, you're not going to have to rely on people smugglers where you're going to have to pay a large fee. We're just going to ferry you across and process you anyway. So is there any point in even having defined borders anymore when you have an attitude like
let me
that?
Continue. It says the agreed scheme will see over 22,000 people in need of international protection resettled from outside of the EU to the EU member states. But the main point of contention it's one of the main points of contention, is that there is a sort of penalty for member states for every person that they do not accept within their borders, and the penalty is close to 22,000 euros per person.
That's extortionate. So that they're going to financially punish people for not taking refugees, and that's presumably if you're a member of the EU. Wow.
Yes.
I've never felt so good about leaving the EU, and I already felt pretty good about it, to be honest.
Well, of course, you can't have it both ways. And when I was in Budapest a year or two ago, I got the feeling that they weren't going to. They didn't like the European Union at all,
Yep.
and neither do most Poles. But they are in receipt of European Union largesse. It's the same with the states in America who get federal aid and then complain that they can't set their own speed limits on their motorways and stuff like this. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Now, what the Poles and the Hungarians are going to have to do, and the Czechs, is say, we don't want any of your money. And I've always argued that it should be a form of confederation, and there should be only a modest membership fee for everyone. Now, I'm a member of the East India Club, for example, in London, and we all pay, unless you're a country member, because you can't use it as much, obviously. We basically all pay the same. We all pay our 500 quid a year or 600, whatever it happens to be. So we're all equal members. We all look each other in the eye and we're all the same. What you can't have is a membership where the British pay in, or we used to pay in, the second largest tariff of the lot, with the Germans second and the French third. And you're either a member of a club or you're not. You can't have this difference in membership. Now, if it was modest, membership fee, everybody in a confederation, it would be perfectly easy for people to respect that view. So the Hungarians and the Poles do not want their culture overwhelmed by an alien culture. And that is the long and short of it. They're still broadly a Catholic. Poland, but it's broadly Catholic. It's not as Catholic as it used to be, but it's broadly Catholic. Catholic with a small c, you might argue, a bit the same as Ireland, or perhaps not quite so much. What you can't do is you can't bring in thousands and thousands of people who have their attitude to women, their attitude to money, their attitude to almost everything is completely different. Incidentally, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not saying Muslims are wrong, or Hindus are wrong, or Sikhs are wrong in their religious beliefs or cultural beliefs. They're not. It's nothing to do with me. It would be an impertinence for me to suggest it. But you can't dump thousands and thousands and thousands in small communities where that is the case. And of course, we're seeing this happen in relatively small villages across Britain. Kegworth, not that far across there from Leicestershire, Irish villages, maybe with only a few hundred people, suddenly the same amount of immigrants or asylum seekers. But of course, they're not. They're not. These people aren't, because they've already come through several countries. And of course, they're nearly all male in between 18 and 30. And you've only got to look at the photographs of the boats and the bits and pieces to see that. Now, there's another agenda here. We've all got to be honest about this. This has got nothing to do with this. This is what the World Economic Forum and the United Nations actually want. And that's where your ideologues who come from the Commission, who brought forward this legislation. It is to break down borders. They don't want the nation state. They don't want loyalty to the family or loyalty to the tribe. They want loyalty to a form of globalism, of which, of course, they are going to run.
Exactly.
They are going to run. So the King of England, who's a huge advocate of the World Economic Forum, one of the initial members of it, he's got Highgrove, Windsor Castle. He's got Balmoral. He's got the Queen's Flight. He's got his own private Royal Air Force jets to fly him about, his Aston Martins, and so on and so forth. Good luck to him. I'm not a Republican. I just wish he'd be a little bit less hypocritical about it all. And it's the same with the rest of them. And Kerry, where did he get that hair? Frankly, you can't do it that way. And so this is what people are going to push back on. They're going to say, just a minute, this is supposed to be us, but it's not everyone all in this together. Well, we're not all in this together. And I think the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs, to a certain extent, will suddenly go, just a minute, we didn't sign up for this. We
Yes.
didn't really sign. This is what, and of course, in Great Britain, it was the common market. We signed up for the common market. It was about trade. It wasn't about a global the dissolution of Parliament and our constitutional monarchy and our parliamentary democracy and our history and all this. It wasn't about that. That was never mentioned. That was never mentioned. It was about free trade. And of course, I'm a free trader. I was 26 at the time. I voted for it. I voted for because I thought it was about free trade. I was playing rugby, drinking lots of beer, chasing girls. I didn't pay attention to the small print. More fool me. But I have since, and I know what it is. But most people in Western Europe don't really understand what it is or what it's turned into. They're beginning to find out now.
I think sorry, Stelios.
No.
One of the most insidious things about this entire situation is that Western Europe is basically holding Eastern Europe to ransom. Of course, Western Europe being some of the wealthier nations, and the Eastern European countries being the main beneficiaries of some of the European Union's funding. And so they're basically forcing these European Union member states to choose between their economy or their culture. And I don't think it's they don't have the authority to pose that decision on sovereign nations. I think it's an appalling thing to do. And of course, taking the large economic hit or the cultural hit, you shouldn't have to make that choice. And particularly bureaucrats in Brussels and politicians, they quite often are from other nations. They shouldn't be having influence over, say, Poland or the Czech Republic's politics. And I was actually amazed because I went on holiday to Prague not too long ago, how much anti-communist stuff was on the streets. It was everywhere. And I mean, it was great. It was fantastic for me because I'm very much into that period of history as well as despising the people, the communists, that is, not the Czechs. Of course, they were all very nice to me. And you don't really get a measure of the undercurrent of resentment to this sort of thing. And if you pose it in those terms, which I think it's going to increasingly be done, that this is an imposition from a foreign power, like, Moscow was dictating to Poland and the Czech Republic, or Czechia as it's now known, that they have to do things their way. And if you put it in those terms, it's going to strike a nerve because these cultures are very resistant to this sort of thing. I'm hoping that that's the route it's going to go down. But sorry, Stelios, do fill us in.
Let me just give some of the details about this, and we're going to have a very freestyle discussion. So it says here, Poland unveiled a new referendum question on Sunday pertaining to the EU's policy on asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa. The referendum will ask Poles if they back taking in, within quotation marks, thousands of illegal immigrants from the Middle East and Africa as part of an EU relocation scheme. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. The referendum is set for October 15, the same day parliamentary elections will take place. Now, one of the things to say is that the Polish people are not entirely against immigration. And it says here that they have received more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees. Mm-hmm. And the Central European country has been less, but it's less open to asylum seekers from Muslim majority countries. So it comes back to the issue and the rhetoric of cultural continuities and discontinuities, because the Polish people, they are aware that their fertility rate, we can check it here, it's close to 1.46.
It's quite low, yeah. It's sub-replacement, isn't it?
It is way below replacement rate. So they are aware that they do need some kind of immigration, or at least that's how they claim. But the rhetoric frequently stresses the idea of cultural continuities and cultural discontinuities. That is why they have said that, for instance, they prefer Christian populations.
I feel like they must have some sort of solidarity with the Ukrainians because they're a former Soviet satellite state that doesn't like Moscow.
Yes.
And so they feel, and also there's the fact that, well, Poland, of course, is a bit worried being, so close to Russia.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain sense of being involved in the way in which perhaps Britain, which is not geographically located near Ukraine, funnily enough, despite what many of our politicians may try to insinuate. Russia's not so much a threat to us. And so I feel like when you're comparing East and West, the Eastern Europeans feel a lot more solidarity with the Ukrainians. And they're also more culturally conservative as well, and more religious than the West. And so they feel a stronger sense of defending their own culture, particularly against Islam, which I think is a very noble aim, because I don't think it's compatible with Western values a lot of the time.
Yeah, a lot of the time there seem to be some Western institutions that people from, let's say, other places, they don't want to respect. But one thing here, why is all this important? It's important because of the role that Hungary and Poland are playing together within the EU, and it shows a lot about the other countries of the EU, the other member states, and how they approach the issue of migration. Now, generally speaking, there is a lot of pro-migration rhetoric because the average fertility rate of the EU is close to 1.5, and the replacement rate is 2.1. So there is a lot of rhetoric that there is labor shortage that has to be covered by migration fluxes. But there's another question here, because the issue is, and what I want to raise is that we are presented with a dilemma that is not exhaustive. These are not exhaustive options. So the problem is that there is such a thing called Article 7. I'm sure you know much better than myself what it is. And it is a way in which, when triggered, it involves the suspension of the voting rights of member states. So what happens is that the EU Parliament has to suggest the triggering of Article 7. It has to vote on it. And then the EU Council, that is composed of the leaders of the member states and I think the president of the EU Council, and they need to have a unanimous vote about suspending the voting rights of another member state. And Hungary and Poland are helping each other. Every time that there is such a vote, it's not unanimous because Hungary backs Poland and Poland backs Hungary. So the issue is that if this government, the law and justice order, does not win the next elections, and if they are, let's say, they continue the other side takes over and continues the rhetoric that sort of bans or talks down to people who raise the concern of national identity and maintaining the national identity, wins, if that side wins, then Hungary will most probably lose its voting rights because the EU Council will vote unanimously to suspend Hungary's voting rights. So what I want to say is that we are presented with the following dilemma. On the one hand, we are told that all member states should embrace illegal migration and should just accept it. And on the other hand, everyone that does not accept it is sort of the black sheep, and we should basically disrespect them and prevent them from having voting rights. And I want to say that there is a third option. Maybe the whole union starts caring a bit more about establishing a kind of Western, let's say, identity, which respects the identity of the individual member states. And the question is whether this is something possible or it's very idealistic. What would you say?
Well, I think one of the problems that we're facing with, and we've been facing this for some time, decades, in my view, and that is we are confusing birth rates, we're confusing population numbers, and immigration. We're sort of mixing them all in the same pot. So, for example, the Poles aren't making enough babies. They need to make more babies because there's not enough Poles. So I got to say, let's have more immigration. Well, that's completely and utterly absurd. What are the skill sets? Now, one of the problems we have at the moment in this country, and Poland will be no different, or I said, well, less so, I would say, Poland, is that there are lots and lots of jobs, particularly the hospitality industry. There's loads and loads and loads of jobs, but there's nobody with the skill sets to actually fill them. That is a child, of course, of a poor education system and a welfare state. So nobody is incentivized to start at the bottom of the hospitality trade or the agricultural trade or whatever it happens to be and work their way to the top. It's easier to lie on the sofa watching daytime TV. So nobody actually moves on. So who's actually coming in? Now, we know for a fact that the people who are coming in as illegal immigrants and so on and so forth bring no skill set. They bring no skill sets. Very, very few bring a skill set. They're just people here because we have a wonderful welfare system. and they're going to live in a 4-star hotel, and they're going to get 3 meals a day, medical care, and spending money.
I saw recently, sorry to interject, is that in Germany, about 80% of the Syrian migrants they took in are on welfare at the minute. 80%, which is absurd. But sorry, do.
Exactly. So we're looking at skill sets. Now, one would immediately look perhaps across to the Ukrainian, who are genuine refugees, one might say, genuine refugees. Yes, they're Christian. They are Christian, Orthodox Christian, Russian, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They are going to assimilate a lot quicker into. I think the days are gone when Catholics are prepared to sort of burn the Protestants and Protestants. I think we've moved on from that, hopefully. So they're going to assimilate. And I married into a Polish family with the amazing name of Skowronek, which of course is Polish for skylark. And my nephew, by marriage, is now an underwriter at Lloyd's of London, was captain of Yorkshire under-21s rugby football, and was head boy at a public school. You don't get a more English guy than him. And my father-in-law, who finished the war having commanded a tank with 1st Polish Armoured Division in Normandy, was a great assimilator. You know, he wore a hunting coat, a hunting pink. He insisted on buying Sherpa vans for his business, which were hopeless and always breaking down, but they were British. So he's more British than a British person. And he made his million, and he sent his children to public school and so on and so forth. Welcome as the flowers in spring. Who would suggest that the West Indians in the 50s and 60s weren't welcome? They helped out with, transport systems, NHS, so on and so forth. So we've got to get in our heads, and this is something that the ideologues can't deal with. There are some people who are welcome and some who are not. And until we start talking the truth, some people aren't welcome, and we've got to bung them out. And if they came here illegally, almost 100% unwelcome, because why didn't they go through the traditional channels, which we could spend a bit more money on? But there's no point in bringing people in to do jobs that the indigenous population won't do because they're lazy or stupid. That doesn't take you anywhere, does it?
It's not also an incentive to become less lazy.
Yeah. So nobody's allowed to speak these truths, are they? Nobody's allowed to say some immigrants are welcome and some are not. And until we can say that, we're going to get nowhere.
It's very frustrating, isn't it? Because, of course, we're getting asylum seekers from countries that aren't at war. Like we get Albanian asylum seekers. They're not at war with anyone. They're not. Who are they fleeing? I mean, normally they're just bringing a drug trade. That's not only a stereotype, but a statistical fact.
And the same also applies for Turkey, because Turkey is not supposed to be a country that is hostile to migrants, but they are not honoring their part of the deal. They are getting money from the EU, allegedly, to hold migrant populations there where they are not prosecuted, and they are deliberately pushing them across the Eastern Mediterranean route. But
that was a very charitable way for a Greek to talk about a Turk. Well done.
And let's say this here and show another tweet and end up with a segment. I'll give you just some statistic. This was a survey that was done, a study by the Social Research Office on a representative sample on 1,000 adult Poles. And basically it says as little as 5.8% of Poles support the European Union's new migration deal.
It's tiny.
A vast majority of Poles oppose the EU concept of the Migration Pact and mandatory quotas of migrants relocated, with 81.4% of respondents definitely or rather against these solutions. And at the same time, only 12.8% consider the EU proposal migration scheme rather reasonable, and only 5.8% were definitely in favor of it. So it doesn't seem, according to the study, obviously, it's according to the study, it doesn't seem to be very...
but surely you'd get the same figures in France.
Yeah.
You get or Italy or Spain. These numbers for Poland are exactly the same everywhere else. It's the ideologues and the bureaucrats and fake politicians and people who want to destroy the whole system under the UN or WEF arrangements, and that's what it's all about. No, the whole everybody feels the same. You going to any pub, get onto any bus, talk to any people. That's exactly how we all feel. So what happened to our democracy? I said at the very beginning, politics is a lark. It doesn't matter who we vote for, does it?
What I'm particularly interested in is the ideology and the rhetoric, because the rhetoric of the EU is supposed to be pro-democracy. And when you're pro-democracy, you're pro the demos, the people. So you can't be in favor of that and simultaneously say that everyone who disagrees will have their voting rights suspended. There seems to be a contradiction.
Well, it's interesting you say that, especially as a Greek, talking about the demos, of course, and the whole concept, the Athenian concept of democracy, to use a wonderful American expression. I love some of their expressions. You had to have skin in the game.
Yes.
And even Oliver Cromwell said that somebody gets the franchise or gets a vote because they simply breathe the air is ludicrous. And you'd never explain it to a man from Mars. You have to have skin in the game. So if you're going to have a vote, if you're entitled to a vote, what are you contributing to the kitty? And if we go out with some chums and we go on a pub crawl, we all put in 30 quid into the kitty, and that's where the beer gets paid for. You don't put your £30 in the kitty, you don't get a beer. Yeah. That's what democracy was invented for all those years ago. We have a head count now in this country, in the Western Europe and America. If you have attained the age of 18, you get a vote. Can you think of more ludicrous abuse of the democratic ethos?
And just one point to mention, because it is frequently not talked about, Pericles, who was supposed to be one of the grand figures of the Athenian democracy, was someone who wanted to restrict even more Athenian citizenship. You could be an Athenian citizen if you had one parent who was an Athenian citizen, and he was saying that we need to raise it up to both parents. So this is something that most people don't talk about. But the issue is here that there is a rhetoric in the EU that is pro-democracy on the one hand, in words, but the substance behind their actions seems to indicate that they do not want the people to claim things such as, we care about our national identity. This is not allowed. And one person here, Guy Verhofstadt, who has written a lot about further European integration and a kind of, let's say, United States of Europe, he says, an Orban-inspired referendum. This is the Law and Justice Party, is taking Poland out of the EU one step at a time, while Polish people, including the ruling party's voters, are among the most pro-European of all. Don't believe their party political games and lies. This is something that comes from the mouth of a very, let's say, esteemed European politician who is very much against.
That's quite charitable. He's the EU's biggest cheerleader, is how I would describe him.
He's I used to sit next to him in the Parliament. He's one of the most appalling people I've ever met.
I got that impression just by looking at videos of him.
Yeah, on any level. Can't get his teeth done.
Well, if you enjoyed that segment from the podcast of Lotus Eaters, why not visit our website, where you can watch the podcast live, uncensored, in full, and for free from 1 o'clock UK time every weekday. And for as little as £5 a month, you can get all of our paywalled premium content, such as Bo's series Epochs, where he goes through various historical periods with Carl, and in this episode they discuss the life and times of barbarian warlord Attila the Hun, who single-handedly held the Roman Empire to ransom toward the waning days. And if you'd like to see the rest of what we're putting out, you can follow Carl over at Twitter at @Sargon_of_Acad, and the rest of us over at LotusEaters_com. Till next time, goodbye.